Blessings, good evening. So we have some questions have come in tonight, so do our best to answer them. Lumpur, good morning and hope you are well. I guess it's morning somewhere. Would like to ask if the knower is separate from the knowing process, the knowing. It seems like it is already the faintest start of a fabricating process. Is that correct? Well, it has to be, because until one's mind is purified of greed, anger, delusion, ignorance that conditions craving and attachment, there's always going to be some mental fabricating and karma being made. But the Noble Eightfold Path is the karma that we're aiming to develop, cultivate, for the end of suffering, for the end of this fabricating process. But until that end is reached, the cessation of all karma, the cessation of all attachment and all ignorance, one is still bound up within this fabricating process. So the first thing you might say is to learn how to fabricate the good stuff and not fabricate the bad stuff that leads to suffering. Make good karma, and particularly the good karma that supports the cultivation of the Noble Eightfold Path, and then stop making the bad karma that obstructs that path, deludes you, takes you further away from that path and creates more suffering and more obstacles for you. So this Noble Eightfold Path, these factors, 8 factors, involve a range of aspects of the practice, cultivating right view, right action, right speech, sila, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi, and so on. It's a complete training of body, speech and mind, but in its essence it all comes back to the mind. You're training this mind. All these factors of the Noble Eightfold Path arise and are cultivated in the human mind. So then this is still a form of fabrication or sankhara, karma making, karma formation. But it's for the end of karma, and what helps you really develop this path well is cultivating this ability to know yourself on every level. So wisdom is a form of knowing, mindfulness is a form of knowing. And then reflecting on your speech, your actions is a form of knowing. But we often summarize it or talk about just cultivating this quality of knowing. You're knowing yourself from moment to moment. The path, the Noble Eightfold Path, reduces down to this. So like, say, right effort, although on paper we talk about the effort to abandon the unwholesome, cultivate the wholesome and so on. Really, right effort is cultivating mindfulness, the knowing, this quality of knowing, presence of mind. And when you're mindful, then there's a chance for all the other factors of this path to be developed, because you're mindful of the path, what it is, what the goal is, what are the factors. So our efforts And our understanding, our mental effort, intellectual efforts, as well as physical effort, is directed at cultivating mindfulness, the quality of knowing. And out of that arises sampajanya, knowing with some wisdom and clear comprehension. And out of that, sati and sampajanya, panya, is supported and developed. So that's right view, and as well as insight into the Four Noble Truths. So the path does reduce down to or center around this quality of knowing. And especially when we talk, often we just talk about developing this quality of knowing, but you can also expand it out to include all the 8 aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path. And there's a lot there. Cultivating generosity, sila, compassion, patience, all kinds of virtues we're cultivating, all kinds of kilesas we're identifying and abandoning. But it all comes out of this quality of knowing, direct knowing of experience, until ultimately the mind is purified of greed, anger and delusion. And then you don't have to fabricate anything anymore. The Arahant doesn't have to. They're with the unconditioned. So there's no more conditioning of the mind. There's no more creating, making, fabricating. There's no need for that. But until that point, there'll always be some fabricating going on, but it's wholesome fabricating when you're focused on cultivating the path. And this quality of knowing is what is at the center of that process. You need it. When you're not knowing, you're unknowing or not knowing, that's avijja in one form or other. That's ignorance. Ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, ignorance of what's going on in your mind. Knowing is when you have knowledge, Jica, and you can know a defilement arising and abandon it. Not knowing, when you're not knowing, you can't do that. This is why knowing is so important. So keep developing this quality of knowing, and you should find it's very beneficial to you. Dear Lumpur, many thanks for your teaching. Can you kindly advise what is the Buddhist view on personality? Why do Arahants and many great teachers have their distinctive personalities even though they have achieved enlightenment? Are they just using it as a function to interact with the world without attachment until parinibbana? Thank you again. Well, there's this term vasana in Pali, which sometimes refers to personality, character traits, personality traits of the practitioner. Because everyone is a bit different, their karma is different, their background is different, and here we'd probably say over many lifetimes, not just one lifetime, but you can look at it as just one lifetime as well. But people have been doing things over and over again, haven't they? Some people, we've been developing different character traits. Some people are more extrovert, some people are more introvert. Some people incline towards a lot of the cultivation of kindness and compassion. Some people are more private, secluded. Some people are easily angered. Some people tend towards sensual desire and lust. Some people love to think about things and contemplate things. Some people are more warriors. So character traits, personality traits, there's good and bad. It's not that it's all good, not that it's all bad, but we bring them with us. It's karma, conditioning factors for this mind. and we tend to reinforce them. Some of the good ones, hopefully, you're reinforcing through the practice, and the bad ones, you're hopefully abandoning little by little. But there'll always be something left, some residue of your character. They say only the Buddha or Buddhas will abandon vasana, these character traits. So all Buddhas take on sort of similar personality, you might say. Once they're enlightened, there's certain common characteristics, even physical characteristics, very similar from Buddha to Buddha, and the personality of a Buddha, the character of a Buddha, there's certain common things because they've abandoned all their past karma and the character traits, personality traits that karma brings with it. Whereas an arahant, because they haven't been practicing for so long, for so many lifetimes, when they reach nirvana, the unconditioned, they've obviously gone beyond the attachment to personality view and all the attributes of a personality. They've seen them as impermanent, as not self, as anatta. So they're not attaching to their khandhas, the emotions, the feelings, the mental fabrications, but there'll be still a trace left of their personality that will be expressed on the outside. Unlike a Buddha, the arahant still has some of these personality traits. They simply haven't been practicing, cultivating the path for as long as any Buddha. So there's certain qualities that an arahant doesn't have that a Buddha does. You know, the Buddha we call a sapanyu, can know pretty much whatever a Buddha determines to know. Their mind is so supple, so adept, so proficient, so well developed in meditation. They can pretty much know whatever they want to know, wherever they want to turn their mind, they can know. Arahants may not have that. They may know many things, and they may have skills. Some arahants have psychic abilities. Some arahants can know karma and read people's minds and so on. Some don't. Some are more sukha-vipassika arahants. You know, they just know more just the path of practice for the ending of craving and attachment, and they won't have so well developed psychic ability or samadhi and so on. So in a similar way, also personality traits, the arahant doesn't completely eradicate them, but they're no longer attached to or identified with as self, so they're not a problem in terms of, they don't create suffering. So, as I said, some arahants may come across as more serene, some are more boisterous, some are more extrovert, some are more introvert. So there's a famous comment, Lungta Mahabua is a monk I used to know quite well and live with sometimes. He was quite, or could be quite gruff. His students had no doubt that he was enlightened, but he could be quite a gruff teacher, quite critical, quite forthright, quite direct in his criticism of his students if he thought they were going wrong in the practice. That was his character. But he said, oh, my character is really gruff, bossy type. You know, that was his personality, even though he wasn't attached to it in the way of an ordinary unenlightened person. But he said, this is not a good personality to have because some people won't like you, even when you're an arahant enlightened and you have full metta, which he did. Some people didn't like his style or his character. He said, he told the monks, you should train to be more like Lumpur Tait, who was considered an arahant as well. And he was a very serene, soft kind of monk in his personality and the way he presented the Dhamma. But having said that, I did spend time with both of them, and Lungta Mahabua could be very soft, gentle, jovial, relaxed, much of the time as well. And Luang Por Tek could be firm if he needed to. He could criticize someone who was going wrong in their practice if he needed to. So actually, arahants, they're masters of the mind. They can choose what they want to think or not think. They can take on a sort of personality for a while if it's necessary for teaching. So an arahant can be gruff and bossy if they need to, or very serene and quiet if that's appropriate. So there's a lot of options open to the arahant. But still, if you live with them, you get to know the character. Some have studied a lot, read a lot. Some communicate very well. They talk very well, explain things well. Some are more quiet and speak. They hold their words and they just speak a few words maybe. There's all these differences. So like Ajahn Chah, people would say, oh, Ajahn Chah, I'd have his... One day he'd be your best, most favourite grandfather, loving, friendly, jokey, supportive. The next day he'd be like an army general, bossing you around, criticising you, telling you off, saying, come here, go there. That could change very quickly. And people were impressed how quickly he could move from, you could say, mood to mood, or personality trait to personality trait. He was like a master of his own mind. So sometimes it would seem like he was being angry with the monks. Famous occasion when the monks had all had a hot drink in the afternoon, which was a treat. In the old days, you didn't get that every day. Most days you just had water until the next day when you had your meal. But occasionally one of the allowables, what we call the medicinal allowables, was offered, and a drink would be made, maybe some sweet coffee or tea or cocoa, made in big kettles, offered to all the monks so they get a cup of some drink just to give them some extra energy in the evening. But it was a treat. And of course, because it only happened occasionally, when there was this treat, it would usually set off a bit of excitement, chit-chat, especially if there's some caffeine. So people would talk, have their cup, their drink, they'd be excited, talk a bit more than usual, so there'd be a bit of socializing. And on one occasion, everyone was socializing, and then they forgot to clean up the big kettles that actually the drink was brought in. And if you leave kettles with sweet drink residue in them, unwashed in the jungle, very quickly they'll become full of ants. And it's unsightly, the ants will be swarming all over them, and if they're just left there on the ground or somewhere, then it looks messy. So that happened. Everyone was enjoying their drink and then enjoying their conversation, and they forgot all about cleaning these big kettles, so they were just left there. The ants came up, everyone went away, and later everyone came back for a meeting, and the kettles were still there unclean, and Luang Por Chah came along and he saw these kettles, and he had a stick, his walking stick, because he was quite old by then, and he thrashed the kettles with his stick, knocked them flying, saying, oh, the monks only know how to drink, they don't know how to wash up the kettles. Which is a sort of thing he might say once in a while, just to wake everyone up out of their daydream or their mood, get them mindful again. So some monks thought, oh, is he angry? But then he walked away from the main hall where he had just done that into a side room where there was a lot of lay people gathered, and he sat down and started talking to them. But he talked to them very jovially, very relaxed. And the monks who were with him said, oh, for one moment he seemed very fierce, bossy. Next moment he's very relaxed and joking with the lay people. And the switch was amazingly fast and complete. So they reckon that's a good example of Rinpoche switching from one mood to another because he wasn't attached to anything. This is obviously open to debate. People who weren't there, even sometimes they debate this even though they weren't even present, but it's an example, or a possible example, of how an enlightened person can present a personality, but they're not really attached to that personality. Nevertheless, people have their personalities, even arahants, whereas Buddhas don't, they've abandoned that. Subtle thing, isn't it? You're a human being, you have your khandhas, you have your mind, your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, your body, and you express yourself. So to see an arahant who's still got their body and their emotions and their personality, and to know someone is an arahant would be a very hard task. Probably the only way you could know is if you're one. You've practiced to that level, then you might be able to know another one. You know that they're not attached because they can explain what attachment is, how to abandon it. They know the way to do it. So, hard to know. Dear Lumpur, thank you for your teachings. During sitting meditation with my eyes closed, I tried to look at the breath at the tip of my nostrils by looking downwards at the direction of my nose, where I could sense the breath better. But after some time, I lost focus, and I'm hearing the sound of my in and out breath. Instead of focusing on the tip of my nostrils, is it appropriate to just focus on the sound of my in and out breath? Thank you again. Well, technically it's possible to focus on a whole range of things as an object in meditation. So the sound of the breath, it's possible you could take that as an object to develop concentration, mindfulness, rather than the sensation, more just the actual feeling, the sensation of the breath. But I would see what works. Can you really sustain that, just attention on the sound of the breath? Because one thing you'll find is that the sound of the breath tends to get more and more subtle the longer you're sitting, and the more refined your awareness, the more continuous your mindfulness. You'll probably find you can't detect much sound at all, or no sound. And literally the physical feeling or sensation, the in and out movement of the breath is stopping, slowing down, gets slower and slower, more refined, more subtle. So my experience is the sound of the breath disappears quite quickly. Before the ultimate movement of the breath disappears, you already lost the sound. But for, just if you experiment and you find it works, well, try it. And if it really helps you to concentrate your awareness on the breath, you breathe in and out like when you're heavy breathing when you're running or doing exercise, well, you could do that. And if it works and helps you to steady your mind, stops you being distracted, keeps you mindful, try it. As far as looking downwards, yes, my experience and many other meditators' experience is the same, is that the more mindful you become of the breath, the more you know the breath, you quite naturally, even though your eyes are closed, but they quite naturally turn downwards towards the nose. And you'll notice perhaps when you are very peaceful and absorbed in the breath, your eyes have turned downwards. They're certainly not moving around, open or closed. And it seems to be the peaceful pose of the eyes when you are more concentrated in samadhi is turned downwards. So you'll tend to see Buddha statues are looking downwards, whether the eyes are open or Your eyes are closed, but they'll still be turned downwards. It will happen naturally when you're peaceful and focused on the breath, but you can try kind of leading it by deliberately looking downwards if you want, but be careful, don't make your eyes hurt. You know, some people do it and become cross-eyed, or they're just forcing their eyes too much. I would actually recommend focusing more on the breath and just allowing your eyes naturally to turn downwards. When you're peaceful, they'll do that, I think. But part of meditation, breath meditation included, is experimenting, seeing what works, seeing what the peaceful mind and body is like. Anything that can help you to speed up the process of concentrating your mind on the breath, keeping the breath in mind and letting go of distractions, well, that can help. So see what works for you. I have meditated on sound before, but I was focusing more on the ears, because that's obviously where first contact takes place with sound. But that was actually the sound, just sound, any sound. I was just focusing my mind on the ears as I did walking meditation, and occasionally I would get into a really deep state of samadhi doing that. And I know other people have done that, so you can experiment, just going to sound, any sound impingement, just keep your attention there with the sound with equanimity, so you're aiming not to get fascinated by the interesting or pleasant sounds, not to get averse to the unpleasant sounds, and not to just not get carried away by sound, but just to know sound as an object arising, passing away. You can do that. There's a number of different things you can do associated with sound, so you can experiment. The aim is always to be mindful, to be present in the moment, and not distracted, not daydreaming, not sleepy. Dear Lumpur, I hope you are well and in good health. I bow to you 3 times and offer my respect. I have 2 questions. First, I listened to one of your talks and I heard you mention a nimitta of light that sits on the mind of a meditator when the meditation goes deeper. My question is, why is for someone who experiences this phenomena, if we are referring to the same experience, why do they perceive profound bliss and happier state of mind than when entering appana samadhi? Why does this usually happen only one time? Well, we talk about samadhi as having 5 factors. So, initial application of mind to an object, vitakka; sustained application, vichara; rapture, joy, piti; happiness, which includes contentment and stillness, sukha; and then ekaggata is one-pointedness, unification of mind. So these 5 factors are what we call the 5 factors of samadhi. So prior to appana samadhi means jhana, and it can mean any of the jhanas. But prior to that, one can already be experiencing the 5 factors of samadhi, but there's a little bit of movement in the mind. One can still hear sounds, thoughts may be popping into the mind. But when one's mind merges through the continuous presence of mindfulness, these factors of samadhi, the unification of mind comes up, and then the mind unifies on its object. There's no more movement of the mind in appana samadhi. It's just knowing it's one object. And there's no sounds, no thoughts, no distractions. So prior to that, there may be light arising, in the mind, like nimitta or light, just the light of the peaceful mind is a very normal kind of experience for meditators. People's experience will vary, so there's no one absolute description of how the mind will be, but it's a very common thing to have light. Sometimes that light may move, fire can move and seem to wave around. Sometimes different colors, sometimes more intense, sometimes dimmer, sometimes brighter. Sometimes light comes up and then disappears, as you say. You may just have a bright light nimitta come up and then it disappears, but you're still calm and concentrated. It's a whole variety of experiences. So I'm not sure why you say you're experiencing this light, you have bliss and rapture, happiness more than in appana samadhi. Actually, bliss and rapture is still a very uncertain thing. It's sometimes it's more intense, sometimes less, depending on a whole range of factors. One thing is just health, how physically strong and healthy you are. Another may be the kind of reflections you've been developing as you develop your samadhi. Sometimes rapture comes up very strongly, sometimes very weakly, sometimes it's there for a long time, sometimes it's not. There's variation here, but this is all pre-appana samadhi. It's what we call upajjhara samadhi. You already have rapture and bliss, and then entering appana samadhi, you will still have rapture and bliss, but your mind, because you're refining your awareness, gradually you're abandoning the coarser parts of samadhi and focusing more just on one-pointedness and equanimity. And equanimity is a much cooler, stiller factor of samadhi, whereas rapture and bliss tends to be more you could say slightly more agitating, disturbing to the mind. So as one's skill in developing samadhi progresses, then one would progressively abandon the coarser aspects of samadhi, such as bliss, stillness and joy, and one moves more towards just equanimity, a very still, cool, pure equanimity of mind. But these things, unless one is really skilled, I think for most people there's a lot of variation. Even in one meditator, they'll have one good meditation and then maybe a lot of not so good meditation and then another good meditation, and until they're very skilled and can enter and leave these states at will, there'll be variation. That may be reflected also in, say, light nimittas. Light nimitta comes up fast, sometimes it doesn't come for a long time, sometimes it's bright, sometimes one can just enter it and has a skill in just focusing on that light nimitta. Sometimes one doesn't even need to do that. There's a lot of variation here. So I wouldn't get too attached to the descriptions you've heard about samadhi. More just see whether you are mindful. Number one, are you mindful of your object? Is that mindfulness sustained, continuous? Is your mind wavering? Is it going all over the place? Is it distracted or not? And as samadhi is developing, well, you're not going to be letting your mind wander all over the place. Whatever thoughts, memories come up, you're dropping them, letting them go and keeping with your object more and more. And that's why these other factors become more clear to the mind, the bliss, the rapture, the joy, the happiness, the unification of mind become more clear, more apparent, because you're dropping everything else. These are the kind of reflections I would encourage you to develop, more than sort of sticking to a script that it's got to be like this and then trying to work your experience to fit a script. Be wary of that, because many people do that saying, oh, I've got to experience the piti and it's got to be like this, I've got to have the light and it's got to be like this, that could actually become a big obstacle. So try and develop a more flexible, open-minded approach, but just notice, number one, are you mindful of the breath, if that's your object, or not? Start there, and keep going with that. The second question, I like to listen to Lord Buddha's Jataka stories, but I can't help noticing contradictions between what the Lord Buddha taught and some of those stories. How can I reconcile these differences in my heart? These contradictions do not diminish my faith in the Triple Gem, but it generated uneasiness of mind because I don't want to fall into any type of offense, disrespect towards the Buddha, the Dhamma or the Sangha. The same happens when I read or listen to Dhamma teachings from some Ajahns considered to be enlightened, but their Dhamma teachings are, in my view, different in nature to yours or Ajahn Chah's teachings. Is this unwholesome? How do I discern if my perceptions are wrong? Even if I know that I am not holding negative views towards these teachings, I just have no faith in them, or I'm unable to digest them and bring them inwards as I do it with the teaching of the Ajahns. Please, Lumpur, provide me with your invaluable guidance. Well, firstly, yes, I mean, lots of people have some doubts about Jataka stories because they're stories and they're presented as stories. Some people are not sure they're really the word of the Buddha, others are confident they are. Obviously, the Buddha lived a long time ago. We can't be exactly sure what he taught, what was remembered, was it remembered correctly, but there's a lot of Dhamma in these stories, and the same with Dhamma talks from teachers who might have more modern sort of stories of daily life that they're explaining some point of Dhamma. You could say, well, this is not the word of the Buddha, that may be true, but if there's some Dhamma, some useful wisdom or understanding to be gained, why not? So these Jataka stories, yes, you might find the Buddha as a warrior or an animal or in these many different situations. There's purport to be the past life stories of the Buddha when he's a bodhisattva, building barami, making good karma to be a Buddha in the future. And so, he may be developing the barami of patience or virya or metta or sila and so on. So there's certain virtues and paramis he's developing from life to life and in different situations. And quite often, as a bodhisattva, he's a leader, and leaders have to do things to help their students or their group, even if it's a leading animal. And occasionally that may mean they might break the precepts in some way, perhaps. Perhaps they lead their group out into battle to defend the wider, they have to defend their people or something. Occasionally we hear that the bodhisattva breaks the precepts. I don't think that would be very often, but it may happen because they're not yet a Buddha and there may be some higher purpose, but like you say, it does give rise to doubt. And because they're stories, you can't be absolutely sure here. So yeah, I wouldn't use it as an excuse to break the precepts and say, well, the bodhisattva goes out and kills or steals, so I can. I wouldn't say that's a wise approach. Maybe just accept it's a story. If there's something you can gain from it, good. Like if the Bodhisattva goes out into battle, well, that's what people going out into battle do. They fight, they struggle, but maybe with a higher purpose of defending others, defending the innocent or whatever. But it's a story, so you don't necessarily have to believe it. Just listen or read and then see if it can give you some inspiration or not. Certainly you can see the Bodhisattva struggles life after life to develop different aspects of the Dhamma. That's fairly clear. And some of them are quite rousing, inspiring stories. So everyone has their favourite stories. But whether they're all absolutely true or not, we don't really know. Often people have doubts, why did the Buddha give away his children, or the Bodhisattva, previous life? We don't have the mind of a Bodhisattva either, so it's hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the Bodhisattva and compare, because we still have probably more defilements than a Bodhisattva does. So maybe they know something we don't, or they have insights that we don't. So I'll just keep an open mind, see what you can learn from stories, and same with teachers who have their different characters, their different style, tell you to do this, tell you to do that. I'll keep an open mind and reflect. If it's useful, good. If it's not, we'll just leave it. And you don't have to feel averse to the teacher. Your aversion may come up, but I wouldn't hold on to that aversion because it's defilement. Just keep an open mind. If a teacher tells you something that you feel is wrong, they encourage you in the wrong way, well, you don't have to follow that if you're sure it's not good for you. That's part of your duty as a student, is to reflect. And the Buddha said, well, reflect on the teachings you receive. Is it matching the Dhamma Vinaya that the Buddha taught, the Noble Eightfold Path, the Vinaya, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, right view? You have an array of knowledge and other teachings that you can use to compare with what you hear from each teacher as you go through your practice. And if it really doesn't seem to match what the Buddha taught, well, just put it on one side. And that may happen. Maybe the teacher is deluded, or maybe they got it wrong, or sometimes we're deluded and we misinterpreted as well, and that's possible. Sometimes people misunderstand what the teacher is saying because they have their own prejudices and attachments as they're listening. And sometimes you witness that as well. As Ajahn Chah said, it's not sure. It's not sure, not certain. So try not to be too fixed in your view that it's right, it's wrong. Wait and see. Maybe it turns out to be wrong, maybe it turns out to be right. It's not sure. And even your own view, your own understanding changes as you practice, and so it's not sure. One thing that you reject today, later on you may realize was correct. Or one thing you think is correct today, later you might decide, oh, that was all wrong. It's not sure. There's this phrase Ajahn Chah used, isn't it? Correct but not right. What was it? True but not correct. Correct but not true. Sometimes there's some subtle points of Dhamma in situations that you can say something is true, but there may still be something not right in that, not correct. Can I give an example? An obvious one, where you say, oh, life is not fair. We don't all get the same things happening to us because we all have different karma. So, one person seems to have an easy time, one person has a hard time, one person has all the luck, gets all the good things, and one person doesn't. But behind, underlying that, there's karma at work, and causes and conditions vary from person to person, time to time, context to context. So something can seem incorrect but true, or correct but not true. You have to think it through, what is right, what is wrong. Or an example, say like one that Buddhists sometimes fall into, a rule, a precept. We say, oh, Buddhists try to keep the 5 precepts. Correct, we try to keep the 5 precepts. So you see someone else not keeping the 5 precepts, you might get angry. You say, oh, they're not keeping the 5 precepts, they're a bad Buddhist. It's true, they're not keeping the 5 precepts, but because you're getting angry, you're also not a good Buddhist at that moment. So your anger may lead you to criticize them, and someone else can say, well, it's true, they're not keeping the 5 precepts, but it's not correct that you're criticizing because you're full of anger. You're only making yourself suffer and them suffer and making the situation worse. So there's true and correct, correct, true. It's a subtle thing. So sometimes the teachings come out like that. There's different aspects. Sometimes we don't know all the aspects of what somebody is saying, the context. Say like the Buddha is teaching something to one person on one occasion 2,500 years ago. Doesn't necessarily translate exactly into our situation here in this day and age, in every aspect, because it's a teaching he gave to a person on one occasion. There may be much Dhamma you can get from that teaching. It may be a good teaching, but it may not be that applicable to you, or not quite, it's not for you. It's something you've heard or read from the time of the Buddha. So you have to keep that in mind. Like the Buddha would say something like, seclusion is a virtue that's necessary for the practitioner to develop seclusion, physical seclusion, not to socialize so much, not to spend all the time interacting with people, because you need to develop mindfulness and samadhi, and that takes some quiet time as well. And that's true. But then one person at one time might need to spend more time interacting with others. Because if they're on their own, they might get lost, deluded, go wrong in their practice. They're not ready to be on their own a lot. They need to be with the group or the community or with other people, perhaps. That's good for them at that time. So if they start saying, oh, I should be on my own, maybe that's not correct for them, even though it's true and it's what the Buddha said. So one thing may be true and appropriate for one person and not for another. At one time, a teaching may be appropriate for us, and then at another time it may not be the best teaching for us, the best practice for us. So you have to develop some wisdom and experience through your practice so you can go in deeper into your teachings and the teachings you receive, and really see what's appropriate, but also not to attach too blindly to views and opinions, because this is a big problem for Buddhists again. We have our view, our opinion, what is right, and we can get very righteous and sometimes conceited, arrogant, say, I know more than them, I'm right, they're wrong. But that's another defilement, isn't it? Today we're remembering one teacher, Lumpur Du Brahmapunyo. He lived in Ayutthaya in Thailand. He would have been 120 years old today, but he passed away about 35 years ago. But he's a very much loved monk who lived in Thailand and was considered to be enlightened. He always said he was a student of Lumpur Tuat, sitting on the shrine here, one of the statues. And Lumpur Du had many teachings, good little teachings. I often remember, and one of them is it's harder to dislodge someone from their attachment to the good that they do than it is to dislodge someone from the attachment to the evil they do. Evil is generally easier to see as a bad thing to be abandoned and to let go of. It's easier. Goodness, whether it's in the terms of sila, morality, virtue, samadhi, or wisdom, insight, knowledge, it's hard to see the attachment, it's hard to see the harm in that, because we're developing that as our practice, but we sometimes do still attach. And you could say, well, this is the path, I should be developing this path of some sila, samadhi, panya, and yes, we should. But then if we attach to it with a sense of self, a conceit, it becomes a defilement, it becomes an obstacle. And he used to say, oh, this is something Buddhists have a big problem with. They do a lot of good, but then they attach to the good that they do, and it becomes an obstacle. So we might do that. We've learned, like you see the obvious one, you've learned a lot of Dhamma, you've read a lot, know a lot, and someone comes along who doesn't know as much as you. What do? We spend all our time telling them how much we know, sharing our Dhamma with the world. Those who will listen, those who don't run away, and we can tell them, in every monastery or in every group of Buddhists, there'll be the one who knows lots, and they'll be telling everyone. And they don't see themselves, they haven't taught themselves yet to let go, but they're telling everyone else what the Dhamma is and what they know. So, this question is actually a very good question, important question. We have to always come back to reflect on ourselves, and the sort of simple reflection is it's not sure, it's not certain. You may have a view or an understanding, good, but it's not sure. Maybe it will change, maybe it's incorrect in some way. Another question. Good evening, Luang Por. Thank you for your kind teaching of Dhamma. I am interested in understanding more about the life of the Buddha and the culture of the time. When the Buddha stayed in various monasteries, did thousands of monks follow him from one monastery to another? For example, in the Four Foundations of Mindfulness Sutta, it says he went to the country of the Kurus and addressed the monks. Were these the monks who had walked with the Buddha from the last monastery? Or were these monks followers of the Buddha who lived in the country of the Kurus, who he went to visit? Another example is when the Buddha was invited by his father to return to Kapilavatthu to preach the Dhamma to his parents. It is said that the Buddha and 20,000 bhikkhus arrived. That's 5 times the population of my hometown. Did the Buddha really travel with thousands of monks sometimes? How could small towns feed that many people? Thank you very much. Yeah, back to stories and information issues to do with now and then the time of the Buddha. These figures, often you find in the Mahayana texts and Mahayana tradition, the figures grow. They call it the great vehicle, maybe it's because of that. So whereas in Theravada it tends to be 500 bhikkhus, 1,250 bhikkhus, 250 bhikkhus, in Mahayana tradition often it goes into the 10,000s and 20,000s. That's just an observation. I'm not an expert here, but it seems to be that way. But these figures obviously are rounded up, I would have thought, for ease of memorization, because the texts were originally not written down, they were memorized, and so you have nice figures like 500, 250, and you get into the habit of remembering them. They're easy to remember. What it means is there was a lot of monks. And you would expect the Buddha to have a lot of monks with him. In the beginning, there was just 5, his first 5 disciples, and then gradually more joined. So Yasa, the son of the rich family, and then he went to the Nilangela River, and the Kassapa brothers had a lot of followers, and they all became followers of the Buddha, became monks. So little by little the number of monks increased into the hundreds and then thousands. And you're right, as the Buddha moves around, he moved often with large numbers of monks, as you would expect. The monks want to be with the Buddha, so they'll follow him. If he's walking, they want to walk with him. And the mindset of a monk, especially a monk who has a strong commitment to the teacher and maybe is enlightened or has attained one of the levels of enlightenment, they're not bothered whether they're going to get a good meal or not. They'd rather be with the Buddha and starve than be somewhere comfortable but without the Buddha. So they're willing to go with the Buddha, and if that means there's a lot of monks and not much food, because there's suddenly a lot of monks turning up in one area following the Buddha, they'll put up with that. And that's not that unheard of these days. Like Ajahn Chah's monastery always had lots of monks living there, and nuns, and the food was notoriously not very good. The villages were very poor, often there was very little food and it had to be distributed. And that's the case, not so much these days, but in the old days, say last century, forest monks sometimes travelled in large groups, going on tudong, wandering, and often the food wasn't great in the old days. Nowadays the world is better off, so you get more food. It's perhaps easier for Buddhists to offer food, but in the old days food could be scarce, but the numbers sometimes were still great. You just got a lot of skinny monks, I think. So skinny monks following the Buddha in large numbers is definitely not unusual. And like you say, once Buddhism has spread, well, there would be monks living in different situations, monasteries, or just in the forest. And when the Buddha arrives somewhere, a lot of those local monks who are students of the Buddha would come together to hear the Buddha teach and stay with him while he was in the area. So you'd suddenly have a massive group of monks form. But you have to read through the life of the Buddha and the text to get some kind of idea of exactly how quickly the Sangha grew in numbers and where they were located. And sometimes information is a bit sparse. So I can't remember, when the Buddha taught the Satipatthana Sutta to the Kurus, whether monks had already gone there first, but they probably had. You would imagine there might be advanced parties of monks wandering ahead of the Buddha. So then they're waiting for the Buddha when he arrives. And there would be monks wandering to all corners of India and even maybe beyond the borders of modern India. Because that's what monks do, they wander. And especially in those days, you didn't need a passport, you didn't need a lot, you just wandered from place to place. And people in that part of the world have a lot of faith. So if they see a wandering ascetic, a wandering monk coming in the morning, they might offer a bit of food. Not much food, but they might offer some food. Just as today you'll get that in non-Buddhist countries like India nowadays. Most people are not Buddhists, but they often will still give food to monks. And it's believed that monks were probably wandering through northern India to Burma, what is now Burma, Myanmar, to Thailand even, who knows, to Laos, who knows. And then monks would have been wandering through to what is now modern day Pakistan, Afghanistan. And we know that Buddhism spread in this way, but how fast and the numbers of monks, well, we can't be exact because there's no records, but you can be assured that wherever the Buddha went, the monks would gather, and probably in large numbers, certainly in hundreds and quite probably in thousands as well. Just as that would be the case today. If the Buddha was alive today, wherever the Buddha was today, you'd get thousands of monks, nuns and lay people turning up, I'm sure. You look at, say, occasions, say in Thailand, but the same applies to other Buddhist countries. When there's an event, sometimes thousands of monks are present. If it's a funeral of a great teacher, well, you'll get sometimes even tens of thousands of monks. And you get large numbers of nuns, and then hundreds of thousands or even in the millions of lay Buddhists turning up for such events, a funeral of a great teacher, because that only happens once. The birthday of a great teacher, some kind of event like Ajahn Chah died over 30 years ago, but every year they have a memorial retreat at his monastery for about 5 days, the 12th to the 16th of January. The 16th of January is the anniversary of his death and his funeral. And by the 16th of January, where there's a procession around his stupa where his relics are, you usually get about 1,000 monks. So in this day and age, to see 1,000 monks is not unusual. I've seen it many times at certain events. One time, Luang Por Liam made a statue of the Buddha, standing Buddha, for a monastery. Luang Por Mahasupong was one of Ajahn Chah's senior disciples. It was after he passed away, they made a big statue, monument for his monastery. And when that was blessed at Wat Pah Pong, there were about 1,000 monks gathered to chant and bless that statue before it was transported and set up at the monastery. I know one family in Bangkok who once invited 500 monks to their house blessing. A lot of monks, a lot of food, a lot of people. So, it's even possible to invite 500 monks to bless a house. So if you can see that in this day and age, you can imagine in the time of the Buddha, similar things were probably taking place, and maybe on a bigger scale. We don't know, but people had maybe more faith in the Buddha and the Sangha, and so larger gatherings took place. I would say it's quite possible. Hello and blessings from the UK. When we meditate and we use contemplation, let's say on death, how do we do this without the mind wandering? I will sit with the breath, and how do we know when to move our focus or what to focus on? I'm not sure whether you're mistaking breath for death or you mean both death and breath in the same breath. Anyway, you can use death as a meditation object, marananusati, and quite often that is just the recitation of a word or a phrase that makes you perceive death, remember death, and you're keeping the concept of death in mind. And some people find that a very useful meditation, just focus on a word, death, 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 or maranang, maranang, or a phrase, maranang me niyatang, death is certain, and you just recite it over and over again. And both the meaning of the word helps you to just drop everything else, all your thoughts and your worries and your plans and your desires, you drop them all and you just focus on the word until the mind becomes absorbed. And then usually you take up another object such as the breath, after the mind has become calm in samadhi. So you may move from death to breath, or you may just start with the breath and stay with breath. But whatever object you use, and all the other objects, this is the same, you need to be mindful of your object. Keep it in mind, not forget it, not lose it, not get distracted. And as you become more mindful, more continuously, then the factors of samadhi arise. One valuable thing about the reflection on death is it quite naturally helps you to consider the impermanence, the cessation of things, because that's what death is. So very naturally leads on to the practice of vipassana, insight into impermanence and not self. Last question. Greetings, Ajahn. If I am not steady enough to sit for more than 1 hour daily, will it be beneficial or practical for me to do the Asupa practice and set the goal to be able to see everyone in their skeleton form? Thank you. Well, as a general guide, yes, our aim is to develop this Asupa practice. Asupa means unbeautiful or unattractive or loathsome. Supa means attractive, asupa, unattractive. You're developing the perception of the unattractive in yourself, in your own body, and in the bodies of others, because most of the time we're stuck with our attachment to the attractive, and we like to look for the attractive in ourselves, others. The beauty of physical objects, people, obviously it stimulates lust, but also other more subtle attachments as well. So it is a practice to develop, but you'll know probably from your question that a super practice is quite hard to develop. Your mind doesn't like to do it very much because we prefer to consider beauty and what we like as attractive. That's what we want to think about and concentrate on in our mind. So it's an ongoing practice. You're developing the perception of the unattractive in yourself, and you may find sometimes you just can't do it. You're too tired or your mind rejects it because it's quite a challenging practice. Other times you can, and you'll notice when you feel more relaxed, calm, peaceful, it's easier to do. But try not to be too ambitious. I'd just set, I'd say a goal maybe if you're meditating for a period of time, whether you can sit for an hour or half an hour, maybe just take one part of that meditation period and devote it to contemplation of the body. Running through the 32 parts, looking at your body, see, like you say, maybe the skeleton, memorize the skeleton, get to see the bones in your body, or maybe pick one particular bone or one part of the bones. But the Asupa practice can also mean any of the other parts of the body. One is visualizing them and seeing the unattractive, so particularly underneath the skin. The skin is, it's the boundary, isn't it? On the outside, we find skin, and the outside of people's bodies, the attractive part. But imagine taking the skin off. Inside is not very attractive. So practice taking the skin off, visualizing inside the body when you feel calm enough, peaceful enough to do it. That may be in your meditation, or it may be at other times when you're just sitting somewhere with a bit of free time. You can go through these 32 parts or one particular part and focus on that. Like you say, focus on a bone and get to really get to know that bone as a visual image, being able to bring it up. Particularly in situations where you're tempted, your lust is tempted and you're falling into sexual desire in a fantasy or an imagination, bring it up then to counter that habit. So get good at focusing on the unattractive when your mind is drawn to the attractive, because it's such a powerful defilement that you need to have some practices to counter that habit. And it will bring your mind to more equanimity, detached awareness. Where were we? So you can do it in meditation as well, but also at other times, like with food. Just contemplate food as you're eating food. Usually when we eat food, we're talking and looking at things and thinking all kinds of thoughts. We're not really that aware of the food, the process of eating food, but sometimes bring your mind to be mindful of eating. Eating has a lot of asuppa in it. Food that enters your mouth immediately becomes unpleasant. You wouldn't want to eat it again. You wouldn't want to eat someone else's food out of their mouth. Food goes into your stomach, it becomes vomit. Nobody wants vomit. Even ourselves, we wouldn't want our own vomit coming up. You wouldn't want to eat your vomit. And then eventually it passes through the intestines, it's digested, and a lot of food comes out the other end. And it's smelly and you don't like it and you wash it away in a toilet. That's a whole reflection in itself, the unattractiveness of, repulsiveness of food, the food process. And there's many aspects to asuppa that you can pick up in daily life, like, we make rubbish with this body. There's bits of the body that, you wipe things, you blow your nose on a tissue and you throw that away. That's asuppa, that's something you can reflect on. Your clothes get greasy and dirty and smelly, and so you take them away and you wash them. That's asuppa, that's a reflection on asuppa. Every day you need to wash. Your hair gets greasy, your body gets smelly, you need to wash it, shower. That's all a super practice for you to contemplate as you're doing these very ordinary, mundane acts. And of course with others as well. If you have families or you have kids, if you have kids, you'll notice their hair always smells because they're not very good at keeping their hair clean. Notice that. Kids are often smelly, they're not as good as adults in keeping clean, and they don't always smell fresh. Very little kids, babies, they poo and urinate all the time, they vomit, they're quite messy, aren't they? You spend a lot of time cleaning them up. That's the human body. And occasionally you may even come sick people. You go to hospitals, you see the unattractiveness of the body, the aging process, people who are sick, whether it's yourself, other people, and so on. There's a lot of information that we're surrounded by that we often don't notice, we gloss over. I would start to make that a little habit of mine, to notice the unattractiveness of the body in different situations. And ultimately, when your mindfulness is strong and your meditation gets better, maybe you can focus on seeing everyone as skeletons. And of course, the great teachers have done that. But until that point, just start in small ways, practical ways, and it will help you to adjust your perception towards the body and develop more the perception of the unattractiveness of the body. So, rather a lot of questions tonight. I'll leave the session there because it's gone on quite a long time.
And